Just as the flight attendant tried to remove her from the plane, a stunned silence fell over the cabin. The elderly woman, Victoria Monroe, met the challenge with unwavering calm and then shocked everyone by declaring, "I own this airline." In that electrifying moment, power shifted and the crew's authority crumbled before every passenger's eyes. The atmosphere brimmed with disbelief and vindication. But before we dive deep into this incredible story, let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Victoria Monroe stepped out of the sleek black car, smoothing the fabric of her navy blue silk dress with a graceful, practiced motion. At 72 years old, she moved with the kind of poise that only came from a lifetime of discipline, hard work, and the quiet confidence of a woman who had carved her own path through a world that wasn't always kind to her. The Dallas airport was bustling with travelers. Businessmen rushing to catch early morning flights, exhausted parents wrangling toddlers, young professionals balancing coffee cups and phones as they hurried to their gates. But Victoria took her time, letting the air hum around her as she adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her late husband Samuel. She never took it off. It was a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had gone. Today was a special day. She was flying to New York for a moment she had waited years for. Her granddaughter Maya was graduating from Columbia University with honors. The thought alone made her chest tighten with pride. Maya, her brilliant, determined, headstrong girl, the first in their family to go to an Ivy League school. Victoria had worked hard her whole life so that Maya could have opportunities she had only dreamed of as a child growing up in the Deep South. She had fought battles, endured setbacks, and broken barriers to ensure that her family would never have to struggle the way she once did. And now, as she prepared to step onto a plane bound for New York, she was reminded of the reason she had done it all. She wasn't just a woman flying first class. She was a woman who had earned her place in that seat. The ticket in her purse wasn't just a symbol of luxury. It was a testament to her resilience. Decades ago, she had sat at the back of buses, walked through doors that said colored only, and been told in 100 different ways that she didn't belong. But she had refused to accept that narrative. She had climbed her way up from nothing, building a career in finance when no one wanted to give a black woman a seat at the table. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. But she had never been broken. And now, after years of running her own investment firm, after proving time and time again that she was more than what society had expected her to be, she was flying first class not because she wanted to be pampered, but because she had earned the right to sit in that seat, with her head held high. As she made her way through the terminal, she noticed the subtle glances, the polite but dismissive smiles from some of the gate agents, the way certain passengers looked past her as if she was invisible. She had seen it before, people trying to figure out why a woman like her, elegantly dressed but undeniably black, was walking toward the first-class lounge instead of economy. But she ignored it, the same way she had ignored similar looks her entire life. She walked with purpose, pulling her small leather carry-on behind her, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. When she reached the check-in counter, a young woman with sharp eyes and a hurried expression greeted her with the kind of polite efficiency that came with working an early morning shift. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I see your ID and boarding pass?" Victoria handed them over with a small smile, watching as the agent's eyes flickered in surprise when she saw the first-class designation on the ticket. But to her credit, she didn't comment, simply scanning it and nodding. "You're all set, Miss Monroe. First-class boarding will begin shortly. Enjoy your flight." Victoria nodded, taking her ticket back and slipping it into her purse. She moved toward the seating area, settling into one of the plush chairs in the lounge. As she took a breath, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about the first time she had ever stepped onto a plane. She had been 22, fresh out of college, full of ambition and fire, and heading to New York for her first job interview. Back then, she had scraped together enough money for the cheapest economy seat, sitting near the back of the plane, nervously clutching her purse, while the white passengers up front sipped cocktails and stretched their legs. She had promised herself that one day she would sit in first class, not for the comfort, not for the champagne or the warm towels, but for the principle of it, for the idea that she could. And now, decades later, she was here. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the quiet before the flight. But before she could fully relax, she heard a voice from nearby, a low, whispered murmur from two businessmen sitting a few seats away. "She must be someone's wife," one of them said, his voice just loud enough for her to catch. "Or maybe she got lucky with a lottery ticket," the other chuckled. Victoria exhaled slowly, keeping her posture straight, her face unreadable. It wasn't anger she felt, not anymore, just exhaustion. She had dealt with these kinds of comments all her life, the assumptions that a black woman in a position of privilege must have gotten there through luck or association rather than merit. She could have turned and corrected them. She could have told them exactly who she was, listed every board she had sat on, every deal she had brokered, every dollar she had made through sheer intelligence and determination. But she didn't. She had learned a long time ago that real power wasn't in proving herself to men like that. Real power was in not needing their validation at all. A few minutes later, an announcement crackled over the speakers. First-class passengers for Flight 719 to New York City may now begin boarding. Victoria stood, adjusting the strap of her purse, and made her way to the gate. As she handed her boarding pass to the agent, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. This trip was supposed to be special. She wasn't just going to watch her granddaughter graduate. She was going to celebrate a lifetime of victories, both hers and Maya's. She was going to sit in first class with her head held high. What she didn't know was that in just a few moments, everything was about to change. Victoria stepped forward, rolling her suitcase with effortless grace as she made her way down the jet bridge. The air carried that distinct blend of recycled oxygen and anticipation, the hum of conversations blending with the distant roar of departing planes. Travelers bustled around her, some hurried and flustered, others moving with the confidence of frequent flyers. Flight 719 to New York City, her last official trip before stepping away from the corporate world entirely, was about to begin. For years, she had traveled for business, meetings, mergers, and high-stakes negotiations, always chasing the next deal, the next opportunity. But this flight was different. This was a celebration, a moment to savor. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about family, about watching Maya take a step into the world that Victoria had fought so hard to make better for her. She reached the entrance of the aircraft and was greeted by a young flight attendant with a warm, easygoing smile. His name tag read Ryan Carter, and unlike many of his colleagues over the years, he looked her directly in the eye with an expression of genuine courtesy rather than polite obligation. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Monroe. It's a pleasure to have you with us today." Victoria gave him a small but appreciative smile, nodding as she stepped past him into the cabin. She always paid attention to the way people greeted her, the little shifts in body language, the micro-expressions that revealed whether someone saw her as an equal, an anomaly, or simply an afterthought. Ryan, at least, seemed like one of the good ones. The first-class cabin was already half full, and as she moved toward her seat, she caught the familiar glances, the subtle, fleeting assessments of a woman like her in a space like this. Some were merely curious, the same way people instinctively observed anyone who stood out in an environment they were used to controlling. Others were more pointed, eyes flicking from her tailored dress to her designer carry-on, searching for an explanation. A few, including a middle-aged man in an expensive charcoal gray suit, barely disguised their skepticism. She could almost hear the unspoken thoughts behind his stare. Who is she? How did she afford this seat? Victoria had long since learned not to let such things bother her. She walked with purpose, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted just enough to remind them that she had every right to be there. She reached her seat, 2A, a spacious window seat with a plush leather recliner and ample legroom. Placing her purse on the armrest, she reached up to tuck her carry-on into the overhead compartment when she felt movement beside her. "Let me get that for you, ma'am," Ryan offered, stepping in with a polite efficiency that made her pause. She hesitated for a moment before allowing him to assist, offering a soft, "Thank you," as he secured her bag. "Of course," Ryan said easily, giving her another smile before moving down the aisle to assist another passenger. Victoria settled into her seat, adjusting the headrest as she exhaled. She allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, looking around the cabin as the rest of the first-class passengers filed in. The seats were filling up quickly, businessmen in tailored suits, a younger couple whispering to each other while scrolling through their phones, a woman in dark sunglasses who looked like she was trying to avoid being recognized. The quiet clinking of glasses sounded from the galley as the attendants began preparing pre-flight beverages. As she reached into her purse, her fingers brushed against the photograph she had carried with her for years. A small, slightly worn picture of Maya at age 6, standing in front of Victoria's first office building. She ran her thumb over the edges, smiling to herself, before tucking it safely back inside. Just as she was getting comfortable, she noticed a sharp movement from across the aisle. The man in the charcoal gray suit, late 50s, silver streaks in his hair, the kind of face that had spent years in boardrooms, was still glancing her way. He wasn't staring outright, but the way his gaze lingered just a fraction of a second too long told her everything she needed to know. He was curious, but not in a friendly way. He was evaluating. Victoria had dealt with men like him her entire career, men who assumed that power belonged to them, that women like her had to justify their presence in places they considered their own. Instead of looking away, she met his gaze directly, holding it just long enough to make him shift slightly in his seat. That was enough. She had no interest in entertaining his assumptions. A few rows ahead, Ryan was making his way back toward the front of the cabin, greeting passengers as he went. Just behind him, another flight attendant entered the cabin, and the moment Victoria saw her, she knew, instinctively, deeply, that something was about to shift. Jessica Langley. The moment Jessica stepped into first class, there was an immediate shift in energy. She carried herself with an air of authority, her uniform crisp, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes scanning the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who believed they ran the space. Unlike Ryan, her demeanor wasn't warm. It was precise, businesslike. Victoria had encountered women like Jessica before. She could see it in the way she barely glanced at passengers who met the expected profile. Wealthy, white, familiar. But then, Jessica's gaze landed on her. And in that moment, Victoria knew. It was the slight pause, the fractional tightening of Jessica's jaw, the way her eyes flicked first to Victoria, then to the seat number, then back to Victoria again. A silent assessment, a calculation running through her mind. Victoria felt it before it even happened. Jessica's expression remained neutral, but there was something behind her eyes, something cold and unmistakable. She took another step forward, stopping just beside Victoria's seat, arms crossed over her clipboard. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice clipped but professional. "I think there's been a mistake." Victoria remained perfectly still, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. "A mistake?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Jessica's gaze flicked toward the ticket still resting on Victoria's lap, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't ask to check it. Instead, she straightened, her tone growing just a touch sharper. "First class is reserved for our premium passengers. You might want to double-check your boarding pass. I believe you may have meant to sit in the main cabin." The words were delivered with a thin layer of politeness, but the message was clear. Victoria felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had expected something like this. She had hoped, perhaps, that she was wrong, that she wouldn't have to go through this again. But here it was, playing out exactly as it had so many times before. She inhaled slowly, carefully, controlling every ounce of her reaction. And then she did what she had always done. She lifted her boarding pass with steady fingers and held it up for Jessica to see. "This is my assigned seat," she said evenly. Jessica barely glanced at the pass before shaking her head. "Let me just verify that for you." And then, without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, leaving Victoria sitting there, feeling the weight of 100 silent gazes pressing in from all around her. Victoria watched as Jessica Langley walked away, her posture stiff, her steps quick and deliberate. The tension in the air was undeniable, thick like the humidity before a storm. She could feel the weight of the surrounding passengers' gazes, some subtle, some not. A few had turned their heads slightly, pretending not to notice, while others openly observed, waiting to see how this would play out. Victoria had been in situations like this before. She knew the pattern well. It always started with skepticism, then a demand for proof, and when that proof was given, a reluctance to accept it. Jessica reached the front of the cabin, stopping near Ryan Carter, who was reviewing the pre-flight checklist. Victoria saw the way she leaned in, whispering something sharp and clipped, her posture exuding controlled irritation. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Victoria for a split second before his brow furrowed, his expression shifting slightly. He asked something. His lips moved, but Victoria couldn't hear the words. Jessica's reply was quick, dismissive, her chin lifting just a fraction higher, the universal gesture of someone doubling down. Victoria exhaled quietly, pressing her fingers against the smooth leather of the armrest. She had learned long ago how to control her reactions, how to stay composed when the world tried to make her feel small. She wouldn't give Jessica the satisfaction of rattling her. She simply waited, her back straight, her expression unreadable. After a moment, Jessica turned back, walking with the same clipped efficiency as before. When she stopped beside Victoria's seat, her smile was thin, polite, but devoid of warmth. "I just need to confirm something with your ticket," she said, holding out her hand expectantly. Victoria met her gaze evenly before picking up the boarding pass from her lap and placing it in Jessica's waiting fingers. Jessica barely glanced at it, her eyes skimming over the details in a way that suggested she had already made up her mind about what it should say. "You must have switched seats by mistake," she said, handing it back too quickly, as if the interaction was already over. "This cabin is reserved for our first-class passengers." Victoria's fingers curled around the ticket, gripping it just a little tighter. She was silent for a beat, letting the words settle between them before speaking. "I am a first-class passenger." Her voice was steady, cool, a quiet challenge wrapped in absolute certainty. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Jessica's expression. Disbelief, irritation, something sharper beneath the carefully maintained professionalism. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. She inhaled, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve, forcing another tight-lipped smile. "Give me one moment," she said, her tone clipped, before turning and walking toward the front of the plane again. Victoria watched her go, feeling the shift in the cabin, the way conversations had quieted just enough to make it clear that people were paying attention. She could already tell this wasn't over. Jessica returned a moment later, her steps brisk, her expression carefully neutral but carrying an undercurrent of impatience. She stopped beside Victoria's seat once more, exhaling sharply through her nose as if she had been inconvenienced. "Ma'am," she began, this time dropping the false pleasantness in favor of something more clipped, more authoritative. "I just spoke with the lead crew and we couldn't find a record of this seat under your name. I'm going to have to ask you to move." Victoria didn't flinch. She had seen this play out too many times before. Whether in boardrooms, hotel lobbies, or high-end restaurants, the dance was always the same. First, doubt, then dismissal, then escalation. She tightened her grip on the armrest, not in anger but in measured restraint. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of choosing her battles. But today, she would not let this one go. "I already showed you my boarding pass," she said evenly, lifting it again between two fingers. "Seat 2A, first class. Would you like to read it again?" Jessica's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't take the ticket this time. Instead, she glanced around the cabin, her eyes flicking toward the other passengers, searching for silent reinforcement. Some avoided her gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others, like the businessman in the charcoal gray suit, Robert Caldwell, frowned slightly, sensing that this had gone on longer than it should have. Jessica squared her shoulders, doubling down. "Ma'am, if you don't move, I'll have to call security." The words landed like a sharp crack in the air. Several passengers turned their heads now, fully aware that something was happening. A murmur rippled through the cabin, quiet but unmistakable. Victoria inhaled slowly, keeping her expression controlled, even as heat curled in her chest. The audacity. The sheer certainty in Jessica's voice that she had the authority to remove her, despite having been presented with evidence to the contrary. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It never was. She could feel the weight of history pressing against her, the echoes of a time when she had been forced to move, when she had not been allowed to sit where she chose. But this was not then, and she was not that girl anymore. She had built too much, fought too hard, and come too far to be treated like an intruder in a space she had rightfully earned. "If you feel the need to call security," Victoria said, voice calm but laced with quiet steel, "then by all means do so. But I won't be moving." Jessica's nostrils flared, her fingers tightening around the edge of her clipboard. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone she had already decided was beneath her authority. Her gaze flicked again toward the passengers, looking for someone to support her position. Across the aisle, Robert Caldwell leaned back slightly in his seat, observing. His brow was furrowed, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest, a telltale sign of a man debating whether or not to intervene. His silence wasn't approval, but it wasn't resistance either. He was watching, waiting, weighing the situation like a business deal, uncertain if he wanted to involve himself. But 3 rows back, someone else had already made up her mind. Samantha Reyes, a sharp-eyed journalist in her late 20s, had been following the interaction from the moment Jessica had first approached Victoria's seat. She recognized the tone, the body language, the way Jessica's authority had escalated despite never once confirming her assumptions. She had seen these moments before. Small but telling instances of power being used unfairly, of people being questioned for no reason other than the bias someone refused to acknowledge. And she had learned long ago that moments like these were either brushed under the rug or exposed in real time. So she did what she did best. She pulled out her phone and hit record. The camera lens caught everything. The tightening in Jessica's posture, the firm, unwavering set of Victoria's shoulders, the tension in the air thick enough to be cut with a knife. Jessica's voice sharpened further, loud enough now that even the passengers in the back of first class were paying attention. "Ma'am, I don't want to have to do this in front of everyone, but if you refuse to comply, I will have you escorted off the plane." Victoria let the words settle, let the moment hang between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her head and scanned the cabin. She looked at the faces of the people around her, the ones pretending to be absorbed in their phones or their newspapers, the ones too uncomfortable to make eye contact. She wasn't just looking for an ally, she was looking for the truth, for the unspoken understanding that everyone here knew exactly what was happening, but didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. She exhaled softly before turning back to Jessica, her expression as composed as ever. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. Jessica's lips parted slightly, as if she had expected another argument, another form of resistance. But something in Victoria's tone gave her pause. Then, before she could respond, a new voice cut through the moment. "Is there a problem here?" It was Robert Caldwell. His voice was smooth, businesslike, carrying the practiced authority of a man used to negotiations. He wasn't speaking to Victoria. He was speaking to Jessica. Jessica hesitated, caught between frustration and the realization that the dynamics of the moment had just shifted. She turned to face him, her expression tight. "No problem, sir. I'm just making sure all passengers are in their correct seats." Robert tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then he turned his attention to Victoria. His eyes scanned her face, her posture, the perfectly valid ticket still resting in her hand. Something unreadable flickered behind his expression, Understanding, maybe, or the reluctant recognition that this wasn't just an administrative error. His gaze slid back to Jessica, and for the first time, there was an edge to his voice. "Are you sure about that?" A beat of silence stretched between them. Jessica's fingers twitched around her clipboard. Samantha kept recording. Jessica squared her shoulders, shifting tactics. "I just want to ensure everything is in order before takeoff." Robert didn't break eye contact. "Then why don't you check her ticket again?" For a moment, Jessica seemed frozen, caught between her own arrogance and the pressure of being questioned in front of first-class passengers. Then, reluctantly, she reached for Victoria's boarding pass again. This time, she actually read it. The silence that followed was damning. Jessica's throat tightened. The ticket was correct. Seat 2A, first class, paid in full. Victoria saw the realization dawn in her eyes, saw the way her grip on the paper momentarily faltered before she recovered, forcing herself to mask the mistake, to salvage her authority. But it was too late. She had assumed, she had accused, and now she was trapped in the weight of her own actions, fully aware that people were watching, that she was being recorded, that this moment was spiraling out of her control. Slowly, she handed the ticket back. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said stiffly, the words bitter in her mouth. Victoria took it without a word. But the damage was already done. And from the glow of Samantha Reyes' phone screen, the rest of the world was about to see it too. Jessica's face remained tight, her jaw clenched as she turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the front of the cabin. She didn't bother apologizing, didn't acknowledge that she had just been caught in a mistake. Instead, she reached for the intercom, pressing the button with a little too much force before speaking in a low, clipped tone. "I need security at the front of first class immediately." A ripple of unease moved through the passengers. Those who had been pretending not to listen were now fully engaged, their bodies shifting, their eyes flicking between Victoria and the flight attendant, whose frustration had hardened into something more dangerous. Samantha kept her phone steady, recording everything. Robert Caldwell's frown deepened, his fingers tightening around the armrest. He glanced toward Victoria, expecting some reaction, some crack in her composed demeanor, but she remained still, back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression unreadable. Jessica turned back toward the cabin, her eyes darting toward Victoria again, but now there was something else there, something darker. It wasn't just authority she was clinging to anymore. It was the desperate need to be right. A few moments later, the heavy thud of boots against the carpeted floor signaled their arrival. Two uniformed security officers stepped into first class, their presence sucking the air out of the room. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the cabin with a detached professionalism. The other was younger, slimmer, his gaze flickering toward Jessica before shifting to Victoria, his expression uncertain, as if he already sensed that this situation wasn't what it appeared to be. Jessica straightened, regaining her sense of power as she gestured toward Victoria. "This passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions. She needs to be removed from the plane immediately." The younger officer hesitated. His eyes drifted to Victoria, taking in the way she sat, her hand still on the armrest, her ticket resting neatly in her lap. Something didn't add up. He shifted slightly, glancing at his partner, who didn't share his hesitation. The larger officer stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "Ma'am, we need you to step off the plane." Victoria inhaled slowly, deeply, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had been here before. Not on an airplane, not under these exact circumstances, but in 100 different variations of this same moment. A moment where she was asked to move, to step aside, to quietly accept that she was unwelcome in a space she had every right to occupy. But she wasn't that young girl anymore. She didn't grip the armrest out of fear. She did it to steady herself, to anchor herself in the truth of what she knew. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed the rules, bought the ticket, taken her seat. The only mistake here was the assumption made by the woman standing in front of her. the assumption that Victoria didn't belong. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was as calm as ever, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet steel that could not be ignored. "Officer, before I comply with any request, I would like to ask one question." The younger officer blinked, shifting uncomfortably. "Ma'am?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, her gaze moving to Jessica before returning to the officer. "Did anyone verify my ticket before calling you here?" A silence stretched across the cabin. Jessica's fingers twitched at her sides. The younger officer looked toward her, waiting for confirmation. But Jessica didn't speak. The older officer exhaled sharply, clearly impatient. "Ma'am, we were informed that you are not seated correctly. Our job is to ensure compliance with flight regulations." "That's not what I asked," Victoria said smoothly. She reached for her ticket and lifted it, holding it up for them to see. "I am seated in 2A. That is the seat listed on my boarding pass. First class, paid for in full. So I will ask again, did anyone check my ticket before calling security?" Jessica's face had gone pale, but she recovered quickly. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "You were asked to move and refused." The younger officer hesitated again, looking between them. Samantha's phone caught the entire exchange, her lips pressing together as she continued filming. She had been waiting for a moment like this, waiting for the truth to be laid bare in a way that couldn't be ignored. The businessman, Robert, exhaled through his nose and shook his head slightly. His patience had worn thin. "Actually, it is relevant," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension, "because it sounds like this woman is exactly where she's supposed to be." Jessica's head snapped toward him, her expression tightening, but Robert wasn't finished. He turned to the officers, his tone measured but firm. "If you're going to remove a paying customer from this flight, I suggest you verify the facts first. Unless, of course, rules only apply selectively on this airline." More murmurs now, more shifting in seats. Passengers who had been content to stay silent were suddenly feeling the weight of complicity pressing down on them. The younger officer hesitated, glancing at his partner, whose expression had darkened with realization. The older officer exhaled sharply before turning toward Jessica. "Did you check her ticket?" Jessica's lips parted, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. The older officer inhaled through his nose before exhaling again, slower this time. His expression shifted, irritation now directed at the woman who had called him here under false pretenses. He turned back to Victoria, his tone losing its edge. "Ma'am, it appears there's been a misunderstanding." Jessica stiffened. "Excuse me?" He held up a hand, cutting her off. "We were called under the impression that this passenger was refusing to follow airline policy. But if she is indeed in the correct seat, then there is no issue here." Jessica's face burned red, her nails digging into her palm as she realized that the moment had completely slipped from her control. Victoria, never breaking eye contact, slowly lowered her ticket and placed it back in her purse. The younger officer cleared his throat before taking a careful step back. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience." The older officer gave Jessica one last look before turning on his heel. His partner followed, and within moments security was gone, leaving Jessica standing alone, exposed. The weight of the silence pressed down on her. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the realization sinking in that this wasn't going to be something she could brush off. Samantha's phone was still recording. Robert Caldwell was still watching. The other passengers were still waiting to see what she would do next. Jessica inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders, trying to salvage her authority. But when she turned back to Victoria, all she saw was the quiet, unshaken resolve of a woman who had just won a battle without ever needing to raise her voice. And for the first time, Jessica Langley realized she had already lost. The tension in the cabin was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Passengers who had once been absorbed in their own worlds, checking emails, sipping pre-flight champagne, scrolling through news feeds, were now acutely aware that something was happening, something uncomfortable, something that demanded attention whether they wanted to give it or not. The silence was no longer the quiet hum of luxury travel, but a charged, waiting thing, pressing in from all sides. Samantha adjusted her phone subtly, angling the camera just enough to keep capturing the moment without drawing too much attention to herself. She had covered stories of bias before, had seen how these moments unfolded, how the people in power almost always assumed they were in control, until they weren't. And she had a feeling that shift was coming, that Jessica Langley was standing on the edge of a cliff without realizing how steep the drop was. Jessica's breathing was shallow, her jaw locked so tight it looked painful. She wasn't used to losing control of a situation. She had spent years perfecting the balance between authority and charm, knowing when to flash a smile and when to apply pressure. But this was slipping, spiraling, turning into something she hadn't prepared for. The security officers had walked away. Her unshakable confidence had cracked, and now she was left standing in the wreckage of her own making. Victoria, on the other hand, had not moved. She didn't need to. She had done everything right, and yet here she was, being forced to prove herself over and over again in a way no one else in this cabin had been asked to. She could still feel the stares, still sense the way some people wished she would just comply, just move, just let it go so they wouldn't have to sit in this discomfort. But that wasn't her responsibility. It never had been. Robert Caldwell exhaled heavily beside her, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest, a habit of a man deep in thought. He was a businessman, a strategist, someone who could read a room in seconds. And the room was telling him that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. He could feel the unease rolling off Jessica in waves, could see the tightening of her posture, the way she kept glancing toward the cockpit, as if hoping someone would step in and rescue her from the mess she had created. He had spent his entire career in rooms filled with power plays, and he knew when someone was bluffing. He shifted in his seat, speaking just loud enough for those around him to hear. "So, let me get this straight," he mused, his tone casual but pointed. "You called security on a paying first-class passenger, wasted their time, disrupted the cabin, and now, what? You're just going to pretend it didn't happen?" Jessica's head snapped toward him, her face flushing deeper. "Sir, I was simply following protocol." "No," he interrupted smoothly, tilting his head slightly. "You weren't." A few scattered murmurs rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked down, pretending they weren't listening, but others, especially those who had already been uneasy, began shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, reassessing. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut in. "Excuse me," a woman a few rows ahead said, her voice uncertain but clear. She was younger, maybe mid-30s, dressed in a sharp black blazer, a silver laptop still open on the tray table in front of her. I'm not sure why she was questioned at all. I mean, no one else's ticket was checked, right?" Jessica's fingers curled slightly at her sides. "We occasionally verify seating assignments to ensure compliance." The woman shook her head, frowning. "But you didn't check anyone else's, just hers." More murmurs now, more shifting. The tide was turning. Jessica could feel it slipping further, and she hated it. Samantha's grip on her phone tightened. She had been waiting for this moment. Because this was where it always happened. Where silence either became complicity, or where it cracked wide open, forcing people to acknowledge what they had ignored. And today, it was cracking. Jessica took a step back, inhaling sharply, her eyes darting toward the curtains separating first class from the galley. She needed to regain control. "I need to check with the captain," she muttered, turning on her heel, moving quickly toward the cockpit as if escape were still an option. Victoria exhaled quietly, watching her go but feeling no satisfaction. This was never about winning. It was about standing firm, about refusing to be erased in the way so many had been before her. Robert turned toward her, studying her for a long moment, before offering a slight nod, a gesture that carried more weight than words. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even an apology. It was respect. The murmurs continued, passengers leaning toward each other, whispering, questioning, reassessing. Samantha stopped recording, but only because she knew she had already captured exactly what she needed. The damage had been done, and the moment had shifted irreversibly. Jessica was about to find out just how much. The curtain leading to the cockpit swung open, and the energy in the cabin shifted instantly. Captain Ethan Collins stepped out, his tall frame commanding attention even before he spoke. His sharp blue eyes swept the room, instantly assessing the tension that hung thick in the air. He was a veteran pilot, the kind who had seen every type of mid-air conflict imaginable. But something about the silence, the tight postures of the passengers, and the barely concealed frustration on Jessica Langley's face told him that whatever was happening here was far more than a routine dispute. He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform and spoke, his voice calm but laced with authority. "What's going on here?" Jessica straightened at the sound of his voice, spinning on her heel to face him with the precision of a soldier caught in the middle of an unsanctioned operation. Relief flickered in her eyes, as if she had just been given a lifeline. "Captain," she started quickly, her voice still carrying the clipped professionalism she was desperately clinging to. "There's been an issue with seating. A passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions." Collins arched an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from her to the rest of the cabin. The tension was unmistakable. People weren't just watching, they were judging. He could feel it. The way some passengers had turned slightly in their seats, the way a few were whispering now, no longer even trying to hide their interest. His eyes landed on Robert Caldwell, the businessman who sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but sharp with disapproval. Then they flicked to Samantha Reyes, who was gripping her phone tightly in her lap, her jaw tight. Finally, his gaze settled on Victoria Monroe. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny. She sat as she had from the beginning, poised, unshaken, her fingers still lightly resting on the armrest, her purse neatly tucked beside her. But her eyes told a different story. There was patience there, yes, but also something colder, something that told him she had been here before. Before he could say anything, a voice cut through the silence. "Captain." Captain Carter hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. But now, with the captain here, there was a chance to set things right. Ryan swallowed hard before speaking again. "I think there's been a mistake." Jessica's head snapped toward him so fast it was a wonder she didn't strain a muscle. "Excuse me?" But Ryan didn't back down. He turned fully to face Collins, his hands tightening at his sides. "Miss Monroe," he said, motioning toward Victoria, "showed her ticket when she boarded. I saw it myself. She's assigned to seat 2A first class, just as listed on her boarding pass." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Jessica stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's not the issue," she said, her voice low and warning. Collins's gaze sharpened. "Then what exactly is the issue?" Jessica hesitated, her mind racing for an answer that would salvage this disaster. But for the first time since this had started, she had none. Because there wasn't one. Collins turned back to Victoria, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "Is there a reason you were asked to move?" Victoria met his gaze evenly, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, she allowed herself the smallest tilt of her head, the barest hint of amusement flickering behind her eyes. Not because this was funny, because it was so painfully predictable. "I believe you'll have to ask Ms. Langley that question," she said smoothly. The captain exhaled slowly through his nose before turning back to Jessica, who now looked like she wanted nothing more than to disappear. "Jessica," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did you verify Ms. Monroe's ticket before calling security?" Jessica swallowed hard. I didn't think it was necessary." "You didn't think it was necessary?" Collins repeated, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "To check the ticket of a first-class passenger before requesting that she be forcibly removed?" Jessica's throat bobbed as she tried to come up with some justification, but it was too late. The air had shifted entirely now, the balance of power no longer in her hands. She had hoped that bringing in the captain would salvage the situation in her favor, but instead, it had exposed her. Passengers were no longer whispering. Some were openly watching, their faces carrying the kind of expressions that told Jessica exactly what they were thinking. She had overplayed her hand, and now she was alone. Collins didn't break eye contact. "I'd like to speak to you in private," he said, but there was no mistaking that it wasn't a request. Jessica hesitated for half a second before nodding stiffly and turning toward the galley. Collins exhaled, rubbing his temple briefly before shifting his gaze back to Victoria. "Ms. Monroe," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something that sounded a lot like regret. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Is that all?" He hesitated, then nodded. "For now." She studied him for a moment longer before giving a small, polite smile. "Then I'll be here, in the seat I paid for." Collins nodded before following Jessica toward the galley, disappearing behind the curtain. Robert Caldwell let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. "Damn," he muttered, just loud enough for Victoria to hear. "That was a hell of a thing." Victoria smiled just slightly before reaching into her purse and pulling out her book, as if nothing had happened at all. But the moment wasn't over yet. Samantha Reyes kept her phone in her lap, her fingers still hovering over the screen. The captain might have taken control of the situation now, but the damage was already done. The story was no longer just playing out in first class, it was about to play out in front of the entire world. Captain Collins stepped into the galley, the tension in the air palpable as Jessica stood rigidly by the counter, arms crossed so tightly against her chest that her knuckles had gone white. Her entire body was taut, like a rope pulled too far, about to snap. He didn't speak right away, just studied her, his sharp blue eyes unreadable, waiting for her to squirm under the weight of her own mistake. Jessica kept her gaze locked on a fixed point past him, refusing to be the first to break the silence. "Give me the passenger's boarding pass," he finally said, his tone flat, all traces of patience stripped away. Jessica swallowed, hesitated for just a second too long, then turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward first class, her movements stiff and robotic. When she reached Victoria's seat, her lips pressed into a tight, forced smile, but her hands trembled slightly as she extended them. "I need to see your ticket again, ma'am." Victoria lifted an eyebrow, holding Jessica's gaze for a long, unbroken moment, before calmly reaching into her purse, pulling out the crisp boarding pass and placing it delicately into Jessica's outstretched fingers. Not a single unnecessary movement, not a single word. Jessica turned on her heel without another glance and walked straight back to the galley, shoving the boarding pass into Collins' waiting hand. His eyes flicked down, scanning the details, his expression neutral at first. Then, as the information settled, something in his face shifted. A flicker of recognition, followed by something much heavier. His grip on the paper tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, only stared at the ticket as if it were mocking him. His jaw clenched ever so slightly, his eyes narrowing before he finally lifted his head and leveled Jessica, with a look so sharp it could have sliced through steel. "Jessica," he said slowly, his voice measured, his authority pressing down like a physical weight. "Do you have any idea who Ms. Monroe is?" Jessica flinched at the way he said her name, the slow precision of it, but she forced herself to keep her posture rigid. "She's a first-class passenger," she muttered. Collins took a step forward, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. Miss Monroe, he said, his tone like ice, is not just a passenger. She is an investor in this airline. Jessica's breath hitched. For the first time, she wavered. She blinked, opened her mouth, then closed it again, her mind scrambling to process what she had just heard. No, that couldn't be right. That wasn't possible. But the look on Colin's face told her otherwise. He wasn't finished. She has a controlling stake in this company. She has more power here than you do, more power than I do. Do you understand what you've just done? Jessica's throat went dry. The blood drained from her face so quickly she felt lightheaded. Collins exhaled sharply, shaking his head, then turned without another word and walked back toward the cabin. He didn't wait for her to follow. He didn't need to. When he stepped back into first class, the air was thick with anticipation. The passengers, who had been murmuring amongst themselves, fell silent the moment they saw him. His presence alone commanded attention. Victoria was exactly as he had left her, composed, poised, not a single wrinkle in her dress, not a single sign that she had been rattled by the absurdity of the last half hour. She watched him approach with mild curiosity, as if already knowing what he was about to say. Collins inhaled deeply, then exhaled as he carefully handed the ticket back to her. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice even but carrying an undeniable weight of respect, "I sincerely apologize for the way you've been treated." Jessica appeared in the aisle behind him, her posture no longer rigid, no longer authoritative. She looked smaller now, deflated, her usual air of control slipping through her fingers. Collins turned slightly, addressing both her and the rest of the cabin. "For those of you who are unaware, Ms. Monroe is not just a first-class passenger. She is an investor in this airline." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Jessica visibly swayed where she stood, her face an unreadable mix of horror and disbelief. Robert Caldwell let out a low whistle, shaking his head as he leaned back in his seat. The woman in the black blazer who had spoken up earlier blinked, looking between Victoria and Collins as if making sense of the moment in real time. Samantha's fingers were locked around her phone, her heart pounding in her ears as she realized she had just captured something much bigger than she ever could have imagined. Jessica's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She was drowning in the weight of her mistake. Collins turned back to Victoria. "I give you my word, Ms. Monroe, that this will be addressed at the highest level. I will personally ensure that what happened here today does not go unanswered." Victoria held his gaze for a beat longer, then gave the smallest, most measured nod. "Thank you, Captain," she said simply, then reached for the book in her lap, calmly flipping it open, as if signaling the conversation was over. Collins exhaled, nodding once more before turning away, but as he stepped toward the front of the cabin, his eyes landed on Jessica. "You?" he said sharply. Jessica stiffened, her entire body locked in place. "My office, the moment we land." She swallowed hard, nodding stiffly, her face burning under the weight of 100 unspoken judgments pressing down on her from all sides. She had made a fatal miscalculation, and now there was nowhere left to hide. The weight of Captain Collins' words settled over the cabin like a thick fog, clinging to every surface, creeping into every corner, making itself impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was deafening. There was no more whispering, no more curious glances exchanged between passengers. This wasn't just an awkward misunderstanding anymore. This was something much bigger. Robert Caldwell let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he stared at Jessica. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath, rubbing his temple as if he had just watched a car crash in slow motion. The woman in the black blazer who had spoken up earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I knew it," she mumbled, just loud enough for the people around her to hear. Others sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of secondhand embarrassment and something deeper, something that looked a lot like shame. They had watched it happen. Some of them had even assumed Jessica was right, and now, the realization that they had been complicit, that they had let it go this far without speaking up, was settling in. Jessica stood in the aisle, her face drained of all color, Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She wasn't used to being on this side of things. She was the one who enforced the rules, the one who had authority, the one who dictated what happened in first class. But now, that power had been ripped from her hands so suddenly, so completely, that she felt like she was standing in the wreckage of something she didn't even see coming. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, tried again. I didn't know. Victoria slowly, deliberately closed the book in her lap, setting it aside. When she lifted her gaze to Jessica, her expression was unreadable. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. She just looked tired. "You never even checked," she said, her voice quiet, but somehow it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Jessica flinched. It was true. She hadn't. She had looked at Victoria Monroe, made an assumption, and acted on it without a second thought. And now, in the stillness of the cabin, in the suffocating stares of every passenger around her, she was being forced to sit in the reality of that choice. Samantha Reyes, her phone still recording in her lap, watched Jessica with sharp, calculating eyes. She knew this moment would follow Jessica for a long time. The internet had a way of preserving things like this, of turning a single mistake into a permanent stain. Jessica's breath was uneven, her hands trembling at her sides. She had to say something. She had to fix this. She tried again, but nothing she could say would change what had already happened. Collins, still standing at the front of the cabin, exhaled slowly and shook his head before turning toward Ryan Carter. "Ryan, get Miss Monroe anything she needs," he said, his tone softer now, the authority still there but carrying something else. An apology, perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement that this situation had never been about a seat. Ryan nodded immediately, stepping forward. "Of course, Captain." Jessica stood there, her skin burning, her pulse thudding so hard in her ears she could barely hear anything else. She wanted to move, to disappear, to do something that would make this moment stop stretching into eternity, but she couldn't, because now for the first time she was the one being judged. Passengers were still staring, their eyes heavy with unspoken thoughts. Some were disgusted. Others just looked uncomfortable, as if they wished they could erase the past 20 minutes from their memory. But it was Robert Caldwell's expression that struck her the hardest. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He wasn't even looking at her with anger. He was looking at her like she was small, insignificant, a mistake not worth acknowledging. And somehow, that was worse. Jessica's breathing grew shallow, her fingers curling and uncurling as she fought against the sting of humiliation crawling up her throat. She had built her career on control, on respect, on making sure people followed the rules. And yet, in a matter of minutes, all of it had unraveled in front of an audience that would never forget. Collins turned back to her one last time, his voice quieter but still carrying that sharp edge of finality. "Take your seat, Jessica." The words might as well have been a death sentence. She hesitated, but the look in his eyes told her that defiance wasn't an option. So, slowly, stiffly, she turned and walked toward the front of the cabin, past the rows of passengers who wouldn't meet her gaze. Every step felt heavier than the last, the humiliation weighing her down until she thought she might collapse under the sheer force of it. She slid into an empty seat near the front, staring straight ahead, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had lost. Everything had shifted in an instant, the power dynamic upended so violently that she barely knew how to process it. She had walked onto this plane believing she was in control. And now, she wasn't sure if she would even have a job when they landed. Victoria, still seated in 2A, exhaled softly before turning her gaze back to the window. The world outside was still moving. The plane was still preparing for takeoff. Life, it seemed, would go on. But for Jessica Langley, nothing would ever be the same. Samantha Reyes had been quiet for the past several minutes, but her mind had been racing. She knew what she had captured was more than just a tense moment on a plane. It was proof, undeniable and raw, of something much bigger. Something that happened too often, in too many places, and to too many people who didn't have a camera recording when it did. She glanced down at her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the upload button. The video was crisp, the audio clear. Every word, every hesitation, every assumption made against Victoria Monroe was right there, impossible to deny or spin into something else. She tapped the screen. A second later, the video was posted. At first, nothing happened. The plane was still grounded, the hum of passengers settling in around her, the occasional rustle of bags being adjusted, a muffled cough somewhere in the distance. The tension in first class hadn't fully dissipated, but people were trying to move on, forcing themselves to return to their routines. Victoria Monroe had picked up her book again, her face unreadable. Captain Collins had retreated back to the cockpit, undoubtedly already writing his report in his mind. Jessica Langley sat near the front, unmoving, staring blankly at the seat in front of her, as if trying to will herself invisible. But Samantha knew better, because the world outside this plane wasn't still, and it wasn't going to move on so easily. Her phone vibrated, once, then again, then 5 times in rapid succession. She looked down. At exposing Airline's shocking video from Flight 719.A, a black woman in first class is harassed, her ticket ignored, and security called before anyone even checks. Watch and decide for yourself. 1,000 views, then 5,000, then 1,000. Her heart pounded. He switched to the comment section. At Justice Warrior 2024? So we're just kicking black women off planes now, no questions asked? At Mark Candle 92. The flight attendant didn't even check the ticket, just assumed. Wild. At Flyrider Fight, another case of racial profiling. This has to stop. At Claire, with the receipts. I hope this woman sues. No excuse for this. The numbers kept climbing. Samantha's stomach twisted, not from nerves, but from the sheer speed at which this was spreading. She had covered viral moments before, had watched how the internet could take something and turn it into a global conversation within hours. But this was different. This wasn't just outrage. This was fury. A new notification popped up. Breaking news. Flight 719 incident sparks outrage online. Airline under fire for discrimination. She exhaled sharply. It had barely been 20 minutes. Jessica Langley had no idea what was about to hit her. Meanwhile, across the cabin, Robert Caldwell shifted in his seat, pulling out his own phone. He scrolled absently at first, then frowned as his timeline filled with the same video shared by account after account. His brows lifted slightly as he took in the reactions, the sheer speed of it. He glanced toward Victoria, who hadn't even touched her phone. She didn't need to. The world was handling this for her. At the front of the plane, Jessica's own phone vibrated. Once, then again. She barely had the strength to look, but some part of her knew she had to. With shaking fingers, she reached into her pocket and pulled it out. The first thing she saw was a message from a friend. Kara, Jessica, have you seen this? It's everywhere. Her stomach twisted violently. Then another notification. Airline corporate chat. Jessica, report to HR the moment you land. This is urgent. Her breath caught. No. She fumbled, her fingers shaky as she unlocked her phone and opened her social media feed. Her worst nightmare was right there, staring back at her. Her own face, her own voice. Frozen in time, captured in a loop that was now all over the internet. The comments were brutal. At Jules writes, Jessica Langley needs to be fired immediately. And not just fired, blacklisted. We're done with this. At Pilot Justice, a flight attendant abuses her power, gets caught, and suddenly she's silent. Nah. Speak up, Jessica. At Never Flying Again. This is why I don't trust airlines anymore. How many times has this happened when no one was recording? Think before you act. You called security on a woman who owns a stake in the paper. You didn't just profile her. You profiled your own damn boss. Jessica's entire body went cold. She looked up, her breathing uneven, her vision slightly blurred at the edges. The walls of the cabin suddenly felt too close. She could still feel the stares, but now they weren't just filled with quiet disapproval. They were filled with recognition. People had their phones out. They were looking at her, then looking down at their screens, then back at her again. They knew. They had seen, and they would never unsee it. She turned, desperate, looking for some kind of escape, some way to claw back control of this moment before it crushed her completely. But there was nothing. Captain Collins' words rang in her ears. My office, the moment we land. Jessica's fingers dug into the armrests, her body stiff, frozen. She had spent her entire career carefully cultivating respect, power, control, and in a matter of minutes, it had been ripped away from her, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her own decisions. Meanwhile, Victoria Monroe finally reached for her phone, not to check social media, not to read the comments, but to answer the call that had just come in. She lifted it to her ear. A calm, measured voice spoke on the other end. Ms. Monroe, I assume you've seen the video by now. Victoria smiled slightly. I haven't, actually. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. Well, it's making waves. We're already getting calls. The board wants a meeting as soon as you land. Victoria glanced out the window, watching as the plane finally began taxiing toward the runway. The city skyline stretched in the distance, steady and unwavering. She exhaled slowly. I expected as much. Jessica's hands were clammy as she gripped her phone, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The notifications kept piling up, messages, mentions, calls, but she couldn't bring herself to open any of them. She already knew what they would say. Her name was everywhere now, her face splashed across headlines, her voice replayed in looping clips that stripped away every ounce of control she once held. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the authority she had taken for granted, was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she had no way to stop it. Then her phone vibrated again, this time with an unfamiliar number, but she didn't have to check the caller ID to know who it was. Corporate. Her stomach twisted as she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't want to answer. She wanted to run, to disappear, to undo everything that had just happened. But there was no escaping this. With shaking fingers, she swiped to accept the call and pressed the phone to her ear. Ms. Langley, a voice said, clipped and cold, void of any warmth. This is Daniel Hayes, Senior Vice President of Corporate Operations. Jessica's pulse hammered against her ribs. She knew of Hayes. Everyone did. He was the kind of executive you never wanted to hear from, the kind who only got involved when a situation was spiraling beyond repair. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. Mr. Hayes, You will not speak. His voice was sharp, cutting her off instantly. She froze. There was a pause, a breath of silence that stretched out just long enough to make her feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty, Hayes continued, his tone even but absolute. You are no longer authorized to act in any capacity as a flight attendant for this airline. You will comply with this order without argument or further incident. Do you understand? Jessica's throat was dry, her entire body stiff with shock. This was happening too fast. She had barely processed the fallout, barely had time to think before corporate had already decided her fate. Don't understand, she stammered, desperation creeping into her voice despite herself. I was just following. This is not up for discussion. Hayes' voice remained emotionless, detached, as if he were reading from a script designed to eliminate any possibility of appeal. Your actions on Flight 719 have placed this airline in the center of a growing controversy. Our legal and public relations teams are already working on damage control, and the last thing we need is further escalation, caused by an employee who failed to exercise proper judgment. Jessica's grip tightened around the phone, her nails digging into her palm. "Sir, you have embarrassed this company," Hayes interrupted, his words cutting like a knife. "You have jeopardized our reputation, put us at risk of legal action, and created a PR disaster that is already spreading nationwide. Your career with this airline is likely over, Ms. Langley. But whether or not that becomes official will depend entirely on how you conduct yourself for the remainder of this flight." Jessica felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. She had spent years climbing through the ranks, years proving herself, perfecting her control over first class, ensuring that she was respected by both passengers and crew alike, and now, in less than an hour, it had all been torn away from her. "I need you to do something for me," Hayes continued, his voice dropping into something even colder, more final. "Stand up." Jessica blinked. "But what? Stand up?" She hesitated, but her body obeyed before her mind had fully caught up. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements slow, stiff, the weight of 100 unspoken judgments pressing down on her from all sides. Passengers were watching. Again. "Now," Hayes said, "walk to economy." Jessica's stomach twisted violently. She gripped the phone tighter, her breath shaky. You can't be serious." "You are no longer a working crew member on this flight," Hayes said smoothly, "which means you have no business being in first class." Jessica's legs felt like they had turned to stone. "You will take an available seat in economy," Hayes continued, as if this were nothing more than a simple reassignment. "And you will remain there until the plane lands. When you arrive, you will be met at the gate by airline security and escorted to a debriefing with HR. Do you understand?" Jessica's skin burned. She could feel the heat crawling up her neck, spreading across her face, her humiliation now on full display for the entire cabin to see. This couldn't be happening. She opened her mouth, ready to protest, to beg, to say anything that might give her back even a shred of the authority she had just lost. But then she glanced up, and her eyes locked with Victoria Monroe's. Victoria was watching her, her face unreadable. There was no smugness, no gloating, no visible satisfaction in seeing Jessica's downfall. Just quiet, unwavering observation. Jessica's throat tightened. She turned her head quickly, unable to hold the gaze for more than a second. "Do you understand?" Hayes's voice rang in her ear again, every syllable sharp enough to cut. Jessica's hands curled into fists at her sides. Her humiliation was now complete. "Yes," she whispered. "Good," Hayes said. Then, without another word, the line went dead. Jessica lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen, as if hoping this was some kind of nightmare she could wake up from. It wasn't. She had no choice. With her jaw clenched so tightly it ached, she reached for her carry-on, gripping the handle as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Then, without looking at anyone, without allowing herself to see the stares, the judgment, the quiet disbelief, she started walking. The walk to economy felt longer than any distance she had ever traveled. The first-class passengers didn't speak, but she could feel their eyes on her, following her every step. The businessman, Robert Caldwell, didn't say a word, but his gaze was heavy with something she couldn't quite name. The woman in the black blazer who had called her out earlier exhaled softly, shaking her head. Samantha Reyes had lowered her phone, but she didn't need to record anymore. The world had already seen enough. And Victoria Monroe? Victoria just watched. Jessica kept walking, her spine stiff, her entire body burning with shame as she reached the dividing curtain and stepped through it. She wasn't a flight attendant anymore. She wasn't the one giving orders. She was just another passenger. And for the first time in her career, she had no power at all. The moment Jessica disappeared behind the curtain, the energy in the first-class cabin shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, but it was there. An unspoken realization settling over the passengers like a heavy fog. They had just witnessed something they couldn't ignore. And now, For the first time since this flight began, their perception of Victoria Monroe had changed. Robert Caldwell exhaled deeply, dragging a hand down his face. He had been quiet through most of it, watching, observing, calculating the situation like it was another business deal to assess before deciding whether to intervene. But now, as he sat there, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest, he felt something foreign settle in his chest. Guilt. He turned his head slightly, glancing at Victoria. She was still seated in 2A, poised as ever, her back straight, her book resting lightly in her lap. But there was something different about her now, something he hadn't fully understood until this moment. She had never needed anyone to fight for her. But that didn't mean she should have had to fight alone. Robert cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat before finally speaking, his voice quieter than usual. "I should have spoken up." Victoria lifted her gaze from her book, meeting his eyes. She didn't look surprised by his words, but she studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether they were sincere. Then, after a pause, she smiled, soft but knowing. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Robert let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. He wasn't a man who apologized often. In his world, power was about control, about maintaining composure, about never admitting fault. But sitting here now, looking at Victoria Monroe, he realized how easy it had been to do nothing, to convince himself that someone else would step in, that it wasn't his place to challenge what he knew in his gut had been wrong. And wasn't that always how it happened? The world didn't just become unfair on its own. It stayed unfair because too many people like him sat back and let it. A few seats over, the woman in the black blazer, Emily Dawson, an attorney, shifted in her seat. She had been one of the first to question Jessica's behavior, but even she had hesitated. Now, with everything laid bare, she leaned slightly toward Victoria. "If you ever need legal representation, Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice low but firm, "I'd be happy to take your case, pro bono." Victoria chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That won't be necessary," she said, tapping her book lightly. "But I appreciate the offer." Passengers around them exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet acknowledgement, others simply looking uncomfortable, as if realizing they had been complicit in their silence. Some muttered apologies under their breath. Others offered polite smiles, the kind meant to convey, "I see you now," without actually saying the words. But Victoria didn't need their apologies. She had never needed their validation. She had come onto this plane as a woman who belonged in first class, and she was leaving as a woman who had reminded everyone of exactly that. Meanwhile, in economy, Jessica sat stiffly in her seat, staring blankly ahead. The low hum of murmured conversations surrounded her, but no one was talking to her. She was isolated now, invisible in a way she had never been before. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to not belong. The moment the plane touched down, a ripple of energy surged through the cabin. The usual rustling of passengers gathering their belongings, the click of seat belts unfastening, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. But beneath it all, there was an undeniable tension. A waiting. Victoria Monroe remained seated, calm as ever, as if she weren't about to step into the middle of a media firestorm. She had known the moment Samantha Reyes uploaded that video that this wouldn't end quietly. The world had already seen what happened, and the world was waiting. Across the aisle, Robert Caldwell let out a slow breath, checking his phone. The notifications were endless. News outlets were already picking up the story. The airline's official account had posted a vague statement about a developing situation. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. This wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was a reckoning. Further up, Jessica Langley sat frozen in her economy seat, hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She had barely moved since she was forced to relocate, her mind too busy unraveling the sheer scope of the disaster that had consumed her life in less than an hour. The whispers around her had been relentless. Passengers sneaking glances, checking their phones, then sneaking more glances. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust, but no one spoke to her. She wasn't in control anymore. She wasn't respected. She was an outcast. The intercom crackled, and Captain Collins' voice rang through the speakers, steady but carrying an unspoken finality. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us." The cabin fell into an eerie silence. There was no polite small talk, no casual stretching or excitement about reaching their destination. Everyone knew what was waiting just beyond the jet bridge. Victoria took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. Time to face it. A few minutes later, the doors opened, and the first-class passengers stood, moving toward the aisle. Normally, Victoria would have waited, let the crowd thin before making her way out. But today, she didn't have that luxury. She felt Robert Caldwell step aside, a silent gesture of deference, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of who she was and what had just happened. She adjusted the strap of her purse, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward. The moment she emerged from the jet bridge, the flashing lights nearly blinded her. Reporters lined the terminal, cameras rolling, microphones raised. Voices clashed over one another as they shouted questions, their urgency palpable. "Ms. Monroe, how do you feel about what happened on board? Are you planning to take legal action against the airline? Do you think this was racial profiling? What do you have to say to passengers who didn't speak up?" Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She simply walked. Her expression poised, her pace measured, her presence commanding without saying a single word. She had nothing to prove. Behind her, Captain Collins stepped out, his gaze sharp as he spotted a group of airline executives waiting near the security checkpoint. Their faces were tight, their postures tense. They weren't here to support him. They were here for damage control. He let out a slow breath, already knowing that the next few hours of his life would be buried in corporate meetings and official statements. But unlike Jessica Langley, he wasn't afraid of accountability. He welcomed it. A few feet away, Samantha Reyes stood with her phone still in hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been in situations like this before, covering political scandals, corporate lawsuits, but this was something different. This was personal. She watched as Victoria continued through the crowd, unbothered, untouched, walking straight toward the exit without stopping. Then the jet bridge door opened again. Jessica Langley stepped out. The energy shifted instantly. There was no grace in her movements, no quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. She was escorted by airline security, her head ducked slightly, her face pale under the harsh airport lights. The reporters turned their cameras on her in an instant. "Ms. Langley, do you regret your actions? Do you believe you should be fired? What do you have to say to the public? You want to apologize to Miss Monroe?" Jessica kept her head down, her breathing shallow. She had never been on this side of the spotlight before. Never the villain, never the story. But today, she was both. Security guided her toward a restricted exit, away from the main terminal, away from the cameras, away from the very world she had once navigated with confidence. And just like that, she was gone. Victoria didn't stop walking. She didn't look back. She simply left. And as she stepped outside, the city of New York stretching before her, she breathed. The fallout was immediate and relentless. The airline's corporate office was already in full crisis mode before Victoria Monroe even stepped out of the airport. By the time she reached her car, executives had convened an emergency meeting, scrambling to contain the disaster that had erupted under their brand's name. The official statement dropped within hours. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 799. Discrimination of any kind is unacceptable and does not align with our company's values. We are launching an internal review to ensure our policies reflect our commitment to fairness, respect, and inclusion for all passengers. Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory training for all flight crew members to prevent similar incidents in the future." But it wasn't enough. Social media had already dictated the real response. Training? Really? Fire the flight attendant and let's talk. The only reason they're apologizing is because they got caught. Corporate speak for please don't sue us. Executives weren't just worried about public backlash anymore. They were worried about Victoria Monroe herself. Not only had they mistreated a black woman in first class, but they had done it to an investor, someone with actual influence over their airline's future, someone they should have been thanking for flying with them, not humiliating in front of an entire cabin. The fallout inside the company was just as swift. Jessica Langley was officially fired by the end of the week. Her termination letter was clinical, devoid of the personal acknowledgments she had once received in glowing performance reviews. Misconduct, violation of company policy, failure to adhere to customer service standards. It was all there in black and white. No fight, no appeal. Her career in aviation was over. Every airline in the industry was now watching this case unfold. No one wanted to hire someone whose face had become a national symbol of discrimination. She had spent years building her reputation, and in a matter of minutes, she had burned it to the ground. Meanwhile, the video kept spreading. Journalists picked up Samantha Reyes' footage and ran with it, making the story impossible to ignore. News anchors debated the larger implications. Activists demanded deeper investigations. Social media exploded with discussions on racial profiling, power dynamics, and the silent complicity of those who watched but did nothing. Victoria Monroe had never asked to be a symbol, but now she was one. Robert Caldwell wasn't the type of man to dwell on his mistakes. In business, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness meant losing. But as he stood near the private exit of the airport, watching Victoria Monroe prepare to leave, he realized that this wasn't a mistake he could brush off. She had every right to ignore him, to walk past him and pretend he didn't exist, just as he had pretended not to see what was happening on that plane, until it was too late. But Victoria Monroe wasn't that kind of person. He cleared his throat, stepping forward with a kind of hesitation unfamiliar to him. "Ms. Monroe," he started, his voice quieter than usual, missing its usual commanding presence. Victoria turned, raising an eyebrow, waiting. Robert exhaled, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted, his voice lacking the polish of a practiced apology. "I saw what was happening and I hesitated. I won't make that mistake again." Victoria studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good," she said simply. He nodded back, grateful she hadn't dismissed him entirely. Then his gaze flicked toward the side entrance, where Jessica Langley was being led away by airline security. She looked hollow. Her uniform, once crisp and commanding, was now just fabric draped over someone who had lost everything in the span of a single flight. Victoria followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet sigh, she murmured, "I hope she learns from this." Robert wasn't sure if she meant it, but somehow he knew that if Jessica ever did learn, it wouldn't be because she lost her job. It would be because she finally understood why. How many times does this happen? When the person being humiliated isn't powerful enough to fight back. Would you have spoken up if you were on that plane? Or would you have stayed silent, waiting for someone else to do the right thing? Because silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. And in moments like these, choosing silence is choosing the wrong side. Discrimination doesn't always come in loud, obvious forms. More often it comes in quiet assumptions, in split-second judgments that decide who belongs and who doesn't before the facts even have a chance to speak. And it thrives in silence. If no one had recorded, if no one had spoken up, what would have happened to Victoria Monroe? Would she have been removed from the plane? Would the world have ever known what happened? The truth is, injustice happens every day, not just on airplanes, but in boardrooms, in stores, in schools, in hospitals. The difference between letting it happen and changing the outcome is what people choose to do when they see it. So next time you witness it, Don't wait. Be the one who speaks up. Because justice doesn't start with policy. It starts with people.